And thank you, Julian, for any of our contributions from the panel. Now, as we enter the Q&A, we would like the discussion to be lively and engaging. We're looking to spark a debate rather than to achieve a consensus. A good-natured debate, of course, but we would be keen to explore what has gone well, as what has not gone well from each of the regions covered. But I think also we would be very keen to hear from other parts of the nation. This is, after all, a national walking summit that haven't been represented here. But we've got, as before, a large number of questions which have come in. So let me try and put some of these, as many of these as I can, to our panel. One is a technical one. I wonder how a volunteer to take this. Janice says that the ability to use cameras to enforce parking offences was removed in 2014. Will there be a campaign to get this reintroduced? Illegally parked cars cause congestion and pollution. Is there someone who could just comment on that particular technical point from the panel before we get started? No? Silence.
I can offer a brief response from experience in Cardiff, which is that the council has sought legislative powers through the Welsh Government to be able to use cameras to police and therefore find people on school streets, which has been a key part of the success. And of course, it then reduces significantly the potential cost of those initiatives. But the rollout of those powers, even within Wales, where there's a political commitment to do that, is slow and technical and legally complex. And therefore, there's likely to be a different position in Scotland, a different position in England, and then a level of complexity to it. But when done, it can be very effective indeed.
Thank you, David. Fiona asks, do the panelists agree that we need a huge mindset reset across the country around the culture of cars and travel? Suddenly there was a default position that at 17 you can get your freedom by getting a license and buying a car. How do you challenge that? Probably it would be good to go initially outside of London, perhaps to Lee. Would you be able to start off on that topic?
Of course, yeah, and apologies that I wasn't able to deliver my 5 minutes to you. It felt really weird listening to myself talking to you when I was right here, but there was a time when I didn't think I'd be able to make it in person, so I thought we'd roll with it. And I think that's an excellent question, the culture shift away from car and towards being more active. I think from our generation and the generation that's older than ours, I think, the complexities of that are great, but I think we should give our young people a little bit more credit than us. They're not as daft. They're already cottoning on to this. They understand our climate emergency and how our streets are being shaped and changing probably far better than we do. And so I wonder if already that culture change isn't starting with the next generation, hasn't already started with the next generation, yet we still have work to do. We can't continue to glamorise it, and I think we should take down the motoring lobby when they try to, or at least balance it with alternatives. But let's give our young people some credit for some real common sense going forward.
Well, that's a great point to make, Lee. And of course also that underscores the importance of focusing on schools and actually getting children to walk to school as a way of changing that mindset. One, if I can come to Heidi, for concerns electric vehicles. Mark says, with the likely take-up of electric vehicles by the population in general, will there be a case for cars seeking to retake the streets due to their no emissions credentials? Is this something that you thought about in a London context, Heidi?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I might just comment as well on the previous question as well, because I think it's a really interesting point. And London is actually quite different from other parts of the UK, in as much as about 50% of households in London don't have access to a car. And I actually think that in all of the debate about low traffic neighbourhoods, some of the time that fundamental point gets a bit lost as well. And so I think that we are in a slightly different starting place in London. Interestingly, I agree with what Lee was saying. There is evidence to show that in London, people are taking their driving test at a later age. I do think, though, there is something, and we should be honest about this. For some people, the car is still a status symbol. You go out, you get a job. In London, it's very difficult to buy a flat, but you might move out from home, you get a car. And that is still quite a prevalent viewpoint, I think, in London. The extent to which car sharing has taken off. I think that if you'd asked us 10 years ago where we would be with car sharing and car clubs, I think we, perhaps would have liked to have been further advanced than where we are at the moment. And, it's a debate that I have in my own household. When we came to get a new car, my husband wanted to buy a new car and I wanted to join the car club that was down the end of the road, because I knew that if we were having to pay every time we use the car, our likelihood of then using it for a trip would be a lot less. And so, it's a live issue. And I do think it's something that we need to talk about. On electric vehicles, my view is that whilst they will be part of the answer to the environmental challenges that we face, they are not the whole answer by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that, even the particulate matter that's generated by tyre and brake wear on the roads, that's of concern to us from an air quality perspective, just as, emissions of nitrogen dioxide are, and the carbon emissions associated with driving. And I think the point about leading healthier lifestyles and, doing a little bit of exercise as part of our daily routine, I think post-COVID, that is going to become, and I hope it becomes, an increasingly important drive to reduce the dominance of cars on our roads. So yes, it's about the environment, but it is also about health. And I saw Julian started his presentation with a slide that talked about, walking and cycling being the sort of miracle drug, the miracle pill. And, I think if anything over the last year, some of us have become a lot more conscious about how easy it is not to move. I mean, if you don't move, you start to rust up. And actually building walking and cycling into your daily patterns of behaviour, I think we need to grow awareness about how critically important that is for your own both physical health, but also mental health.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Julian, I think this one is from Susie. Susie says that in London, we have an integrated public transport system. What more do you think can be done elsewhere, particularly in your areas like Essex, which have a large rural area? How do you think progress can be made in that? And anything you want to say also on the point about electric vehicles might be relevant as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because in Essex, the towns are relatively small, so they're quite walkable. And so the livable neighbourhoods that we're looking to create link then to our wider walking network into town centres. And then we're looking at how you can promote that in terms of behaviour change with better signage and legibility, and therefore how you could link up to stations and buses. And I think buses are really key to this. With the bus recovery and all the announcements we've heard this week, I think if you can link walking to buses, you can encourage more bus trips, more walk trips. So interchange is really important. And in my presentation, I was rushing a little bit. I didn't really get a chance to show you the slide, but we've been exploring a concept called mobility hubs, where you can look at new mobility. So you can look at a sort of a more upgraded bus stop interchange where maybe more than one route meet and connect. So people could change buses, where you might pick up an e-scooter, an e-bike, or different forms of transport, or you may pick up a hire car or a hire EV. So it's not always about having the level of infrastructure that a big city like London or Birmingham or Manchester would have. It's about how you use the infrastructure you've got so that you can persuade people to be sort of more multimodal. But I think the rail interchanges are really important, because we've got a really good radial network to London. So I think the interchange at rail is very important. And then with regards to the EVs, I think, yeah, they're not a panacea. No, we're not going to meet our climate goals with just the transition to EVs. That won't cut it. We really do need a big modal shift to active travel, to walking for short trips, and then cycling as well.
Thank you. I mean, Mark from Living Streets Riverside Group asks the question, do online tours and consultations undertaken at speed in the context of pressure on local authority officers not risk amplifying precisely the voices already supportive of walking and not the range of voices called for? David, could you...
Yeah, the simple answer is yes, and therefore one must guard against that significantly. I think one of the ways you address that is by reaching out through, and Julian mentioned some of these things, through social media and different groups through social media, because while not everyone will be on sort of following the Twitter feed of the local council, they may well be in a local group of parents, or they may well be in the local group of Cardiff City Supporters Club, or whatever else. So thinking beyond sort of the very traditional, well, the more traditional means, but I also believe there is, and the pandemic complicates this immensely. There is a need to reach out face to face wherever possible to a lot of those people who don't regularly access those online consultations, and I've seen some excellent examples where you sort of have a neighbourhood map sort of on a large scale, and people are encouraged to come along and place pins and place comments on that map, on those areas I physically in a sort of central square or somewhere where you've got this huge blown up map and people can add comments to it. And I think those kind of engagements are an important way to do that. So there is a danger. You have to be aware of it, and you have to put proactive measures in place to tackle it.
Thank you, David. Heidi, I wonder if you could take this one from Councillor Susie Smith. She said, last year I presented a motion to the council for a ban on pavement parking and pavement obstruction. It was approved, but officers feel we can only introduce these measures if central government implement the ban on pavement parking across England. Thoughts from the panel on what action the government needs to take on pavement parking?
Okay, so I need to fess up here and say that I'm not an expert on pavement parking, and I suspect there may be people who are on the panel that might be better at responding to that question than me. Can I do my old trick, Michael, and just pass a comment on the last question again? Because, sorry. One of the things I would say about consultation, in my experience, both as a councillor like Mary and a member of Parliament, is that no matter how much consultation you do, no matter how good the consultation there is, there will still be controversy around some of these schemes. And I think that's why political leadership is really, really important in this, because if we're going to make change and we're not going to accept the status quo, the hardest decisions are always the ones where 52% of people are for it and 48% of people are against it. And I use that figure purposefully because I live in a low traffic neighbourhood that was implemented last summer. And when I walked out of my front door on the occasions I went for my daily walk, to be honest, if the debate about it felt as toxic, frankly, as the Brexit debate. My local authority had done a huge amount of consultation, not just online, huge pamphlets that came through the doors with glossaries of, what modal filters were, et cetera, and so they went above and beyond, and it had been a period of years of consultation in effect before that low traffic neighbourhood came in. And so I just don't think we should kid ourselves that even if you do best in class consultation, that there will always be consensus. And I think that's a really important point for people to remember.
Thank you for that. We have a question coming in, which I'll go to Lee from the Creative Highland Council. It's from Julian, and he said, I'd be interested in the structure of your team, how do you work with road colleagues, and what professional skills do your team have? Lee, I think that's directed in terms of your team in response of the Active Nation Commission of Transport Scotland.
Yeah, so mine is a really interesting post, and it might be worth just clarifying who I'm responsible to. So my post is funded by Transport Scotland, but I'm independent of government. I report directly to the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, and I work very closely with active travel delivery partners and stakeholders in the community and Transport Scotland. So bring those two things together. And this is a really good question because I speak largely to the active travel team within Transport Scotland. I feel like I'm missing a trick. I need to be getting in there and speaking to trunk roads and joining up trunk roads in education. You know, I need to be getting rail to be having conversations with social justice. These are the conversations that need to happen. And yet I think we're still very stuck in our siloed ways of working. And so I suppose breaking down those barriers out of, and there is, on a personal level, everybody knows this, on a personal level, you can cut across silos and you can make these connections. But I think on a strategic, on a structural level, we need to be breaking down those barriers so that active travel is woven through all of the other parts of transport in Scotland. And if anyone's got ideas of ways that I can do that, then please let me know. But working on the personal and little by little and slowly, and joining up agendas from the grassroots as well as from the top down seems to be working.
Thank you, Lee. I mean, are there any other members of the panel who have any advice for Lee on how to build those relationships and work with road teams? Anyone want to come in there? Julian, please.
Yeah, no, this is very much my area and what we've been trying to achieve in Essex. It requires a lot of it requires a program structure and a lot of work in between all the different disciplines. So engineers, designers, planners, bringing everyone together literally for, probably regular weekly meetings, sometimes daily, where you start to build a culture of trust and start to understand each other's agendas and the win-wins and how you help each other. So it's quite labour intensive, I think, but I think it can be quite successful. Yeah.
Julian, whilst I'm with you, Jenny's asked a follow-up question to your comments regarding modal filters. So Julian's comments read modal filters only on request, with government funding and targets being set in many areas for low traffic neighbourhoods. Is there a risk that these are inflicted on communities rather than introduced with and in response to community needs?
I think that's a really important point. And broadly, it's the approach we're taking in Essex. So we don't start off with the modal filters is our proposal with our livable neighbourhoods. We start off with the community engagement so we can do the deep listening work to move to a point where you can do the co-creation, where you work with communities to try and understand how you may lay out the intervention. So where you might have a pocket park, some green infrastructure, some crossing points, and then what that means to the wider touch points like the bus stops or to the nearest high streets. So that is our approach. Now, if residents then say, look, we think that's a rat run, can we have a modal filter? Can we close that off? Absolutely brilliant. We would want to do that, but it would be with the community and not from the sort of starting point of the modal filter. That's our approach anyway.
Great, thank you very much for clarifying that. And Daffod, Jessica has followed up to your comments and asked if you could say a little bit more about it. You mentioned that you're able to ensure 75% of support on a neighbourhood level. How do you do this, and how do you evidence and measure this level of support?
Well, I think a number of the points that have been made around consultation are important. There's also a piece of work around building. They're political alliances, but they're political with a small p, in the sense of engaging. There are people right across the political divide who support increased walking and cycling. There are people across different organisations, different campaigning organisations who support more livable communities and neighbourhoods. So making common cause with them. I also think, and it comes back in part to the point made by Heidi, 75% is nowhere near a consensus, yeah? There will always be those who will complain, and there will always be those who seek to undermine the positive changes that we're trying to achieve. I mean, let's take one step back. What we're talking about is changing the pattern of society where a private car has been dominant for probably for most of the past 50, 75 years. Yes, that's a big ask. So, but then it becomes in listening and making changes to those plans as needed. I cited an example of a school recently, but what you did there was ask every parent to transport plan their journey to school, identify a whole series of problems along the way, and seek to address those in consultation and working with those parents, which has included sort of walking buses, it's included changes to junctions, but in that instance, it hasn't included any modal filters. And it comes back to Julian's point there, is that you can put a series of interventions in then, as long as you're careful, planned, listening, to get towards that sort of 75% level. And the other point then is once you get to that sort of 75%, 80% level, those who may have doubts will be speaking to fellow neighbours and colleagues who may not share those doubts and will be able to persuade them around. And what you end up with then is only a small minority who are very vocal, but who are opposed. So you then do a formal consultation. You could get a large number of positive responses, which, as council officers do, will be tallied up and will be considered and will be analysed, and a report would go to cabinet. And the consultation responses would show that level of support. So it's those building blocks, but it's listening. And particularly listening, not to sort of, in Welsh we say the cadwedig ride, not to those who are utterly convinced, like myself, but it's to those who need a little bit of persuading and a little bit of convincing, and being ready to modify your plans to bring those people with you. And if you can do that, it does give you a stronger basis for moving forward.
Wonderful, thank you, David. I'm going to ask Heidi if she wants to follow on with any further thoughts on that point. But also, we've had a very specific question from Living Street South Hertfordshire local group, who asked Heidi, are you aware of the severance of Scratchwood Park from Mount by the A1 in the London Borough of Barnet? We have one-way bus stops on a dual carriageway A1 where you can arrive by bus and there is no access to the other carriageway to go home. So it's always very, along as the macro issues, some very micro issues, but nonetheless very real. Heidi.
Yeah, so on the sort of first point about a follow-on from what David has been talking about, the only other observation I would make is that sometimes local authorities are very used to thinking about the local administrative boundaries that make up their borough area. So they tend to think in terms of schemes in wards some of the time, and sometimes schemes within their own borough. And in a big city like London, some of the schemes where we've had more difficulty around what the knock-on impact of, for example, a low traffic neighbourhood is on adjacent roads, have often corresponded to where schemes have been built up on the basis of the administrative boundaries. And I actually think that both within and between local authorities, it's incumbent upon both the officers and the political leadership to be thinking about what the natural communities and natural neighbourhoods are, as opposed to the boundaries that are defined by electoral wards. And so I think it's always really hard when you do a consultation about where you draw the line in terms of who you're engaging with, if you're doing it physically by putting pieces of paper through people's letterboxes. Obviously, when it's online, there's a greater opportunity for more people to engage with it. But I do think that that's something that really needs to be given some thought going forward, because it's often people who feel that they've been excluded from having their say on a scheme that is one of the most challenging areas. In terms of the specific question, I think it was about a location up in Barnet. This is one of the hazards of my job, to be honest. I'm the deputy mayor for a city of 9 million people, and I'm often asked very specific questions about very specific locations, and I've got to admit I don't know the detail of, I think it was Scratchwood Park that you mentioned. What I would say is if the members of, I think it was South Hertfordshire Living Streets Group, want to get in touch with me about it, I'm sure Mary and the team at Living Streets could pass my email address on so that you could drop me an email and I'd happily look into it. So can't give you an answer now, but happy to take it away if you drop me an email.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Sorry for putting you on the spot there, but I think that's a good outcome. Enrico Marenko says, is removing on-street parking the first step to giving road space to pedestrians? How would you respond if a council says that it's not possible to do that in an area due to the lack of funds? Who would like to take that one? Julian?
Yeah, I'm not sure entirely that it's necessary. For me, pavement parking and obstructions can be more of a problem. So if we can free up the pavements and liberate them, I think that's a really good step. And then you need to work with communities to manage parking on streets. So it could be that we can release some parking provision to create pocket parks and use that space more socially for traffic calming and to make spaces safer. But cars, I don't think we need to necessarily be removing, cars from streets. It's for me, it's more about the pavement space and the crossing points and making sure that the walking environment and the infrastructure is really good. And I think the Healthy Streets approach in London has been excellent in kind of raising awareness of and giving a framework for how streets can be healthy and walkable. So I think it'd probably be good to have a look at that. Yeah.
Could I raise a question from Denise Hussain, who has asked a question about e-scooters and whether they should be permitted on our roads and footways. What measures are needed to ensure that they safely coexist with other modes? And I think that this speaks perhaps to a wider point that the panel might want to deal with, which is how in the process of creating low traffic neighbourhoods, you also create inclusive neighbourhoods. Daphne, would you be able to lead us off on that?
Well, I'll just kick off with a few comments on e-scooters. My view is that they do offer significant potential as a personal travel mode. If we could sort of swap 1,000 cars for 1,000 e-scooters, I think properly done, that could be a major step forward. However, my great fear is at the moment, they are growing like topsy. I see many people around flying along on their e-scooters, somewhat with varying degrees of danger. And I think we need a large-scale conversation about how you put a framework in place that makes it safe for people to use e-scooters legally, but also then retains the safety for those who are walking and cycling at various points. And those are tricky issues. And at the moment, I don't think we're addressing them properly. And we desperately need to, because what I see on a daily basis is increasing numbers of people going to these low-cost, relatively convenient personal devices. But there is a major issue here we need to tackle.
Thank you, David. Heidi, would you come in on that point?
Yeah, just a couple of comments on this. In London, we are about to announce our partners for a trial of e-scooters that will commence in the next couple of months. We've been very clear that as part of this trial, where people will rent e-scooters, they shouldn't be used on the pavements. We've also made it a requirement of the trial that the companies that are participating in it have geofencing in place for where these scooters are allowed to be parked. Because if you cast your mind back a couple of years when we had a load of dockless bikes that appeared on our streets in some of our big cities, certainly in London, they became quite hazardous and they were strewn on pavements. You saw them in canals and rivers. And they did, whilst in many respects, I think dockless bikes, if managed appropriately, could offer some really positive options for travel. They had become quite hazardous, and so London had to take some action at that time to get them off the streets and sort the problem out. So we have been very strict with our requirements going forward about the technology that will actually physically prevent someone from just randomly leaving a e-scooter that they've rented in the middle of the pavement and blocking it for other people. I think one of the other things that we need to be looking at is the speed limit of these devices and what an appropriate speed limit is. The government, I think, have set a speed limit of 15 miles per hour. In London, the 3 operators in the trial, I think, will have scooters that operate slower than that. We also need to think about the standards on e-scooters as well. The requirement for e-scooters to have lights, to have the ability to audibly through some sort of bell or device to make people aware of their presence on the roads. And so in the trial that will be happening in London, we have set very stringent conditions for the standards that have to be met before these vehicles are and these devices are allowed out on the streets. So we want to put safety at the heart of this trial. The government asked local authorities to come forward and set these trials up. In London, Transport for London has become involved because there are 33 London boroughs, and so there needs to be coordination across the boroughs for the scheme to work and make any sort of sense. But those are some of the things that we're pushing really hard.
Thank you so much. Wendy has a question for Lee Craigie about how do we bring back the joy of seeing youths on their bikes in your presentation? You have the wonderful pictures of young people happily on their bikes. I'm always happy to see groups of teenagers on bikes. Question from Wendy there. Lee, how would you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. That's an absolutely brilliant question, and I think at the nub of what is driving almost all of my objectives. How do we retain the joy? And I suppose just listening to that last conversation there, I was like, yeah, I totally agree with everything that Heidi's just said. And then there was a little bit of me that was like, yeah, but have you had a shot on one? Not you, Heidi, I know you probably have, but anyone that hasn't had a shot on an e-scooter, they're fun as well. This is a real way where people can traverse a city when they would normally call an Uber. And I've been in close confines with someone who was like, let's get an Uber, and then completely changed their whole mind about traveling through a city because of an e-scooter. So it's about having these conversations, but always with one eye on the permissive and on the joy giving of a form of transport. And in answer to Wendy's question, how do we make sure that our young people still retain the joy of riding bikes? If we wait until we have safe, segregated cycling infrastructure in all of our built-up areas in order to allow our children to travel safely, and we impose our standards of that safety on our children, then we're going to miss a trick here. I think we need to make sure that our young people, they are exuberant anyway. They want to travel autonomously. They want to travel independently. We need to stop calling cycling to, when we're talking to young people, as active travel. Let's think about it in a different way. Let's talk about adventuring to school. Let's take them the long way round. Let's find the green space. Let's even think about merging, this is a contentious issue, but merging sport and travel and tourism, and think about these things in a different way. Get a pump track put in a school ground so that kids say to their mums and dads, I want to cycle to school, and mums and dads just have to find a way to get their child on that bike to that school ground in order for that to take place. It's going to be a work in progress, I think, but there are ways that we can absolutely do it now, like tomorrow, right now. We can find the joy in ourselves and not automatically go to a place of restriction and safety and waiting for and anger that we're in this position where cars dominate, and find creative solutions now so we don't lose this joy that already exists.
Great, great answer. Thanks very much. Leanne from Manchester has a question which goes back to the point about inclusivity. She talks about how involving cities in residents in cities that are very diverse. She says that in Manchester, for example, the engagement from Black and Asian communities has been low, and that's what the panel would suggest to increase that participation. Do we have a volunteer to take that on first, or if not, then I'll probably go to Heidi.
I think it's pretty much what a lot of people have already said about the routes through which you engage with people. I think the groups of mums at the school gates, and in London that will be a very diverse group of people, and I suspect that in London as well, don't have the figures to hand, but in terms of car ownership is lower amongst poorer groups in the population, and that sadly and wrongly disproportionately Black and ethnic minority Londoners are poorer as well. And so if you can find a way of reaching existing groups in the community to have these conversations, and not just rely upon them seeing a tweet or reading the letter that comes through the door, I think that's really important. And David made the point very earlier about word of mouth and how you engage people in that. One of the things that we have seen over the last year, it's been very noticeable in my area, which is southeast London. Prior to the pandemic, I would cycle into the office in central London, perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. And I would say predominantly the people who I saw cycling were white men. The demographic makeup of people who are cycling in the streets around this part of London is noticeably and visibly different. A lot more women, a lot more children, a lot more people from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds. And so if there is ever a moment to try and crack this nut, it is now, because I think people are going through a period of reset as we come out of lockdown. And I think part of it is, the basics of good consultation, not expecting people to come to you, but go to them where they are. That probably is the answer.
Could you follow up on that point?
So yeah, one of the things I've seen, and one of the excellent examples I've seen, is we've got a hire scheme in Cardiff, and one of their ambassadors, a lady called Maimuna Suleiman, has done particular work with ethnic minority women, and how you build those kind of inclusive approaches to cycling. And I'm fascinated by Heidi's point there. Our hire bike scheme has a different demographic to those who ride their bikes around Cardiff. And I suspect you're seeing similar patterns of differentials, hire bikes versus people who have their own bikes, people who are walking as opposed to people who are cycling. And it's understanding those and then working with those different groups to increase participation. And it's a broader question. We know that poorer households are less likely to be active in sport. We know that BAME households, particularly women, are less likely to be physically active. So, I mean, there's a challenge, but there's an enormous opportunity here to bring far more members of our communities into the walking and cycling revolution, hopefully.
Thank you, David. One for Julian, from Kit. Kit says, how can we get both officers and members at a local authority level to check walkability on planning applications, indeed to question why a new estate on land beside a supermarket has no direct link to it, or a highways department thinking of an island crossing on an A road is fine for a route for a school. Julian, could you talk on that issue?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it's a challenge. Within the way local plans are developed, the planning officers need more tools. I was at a Landor event last week, and we were introduced to a new tool called ActDev for planners for the front end, to really look at active travel and how it can be designed in and it can be considered against planning applications. So that's going to be part of it going forward. And then in Essex and across a lot of places in England, we have local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, what we call LC WIPs. And we've developed them for our 5 key towns. So we've actually developed a walking network and walking zones, and they will hopefully be adopted as supplementary planning guidance, or they will also shape developer contributions to improve walking infrastructure in the environment. So it's a mixture of it, the very front end at the planning end, and then for transport officers as well, to be able to influence development to ensure that we've got really good walking networks.
Just following on from that, another one for you, if you could. Nina was asking about the lack of footpaths in semi-rural roads outside towns is a real safety issue. In many places, there is room for a pavement, but there is not. What more could be done to address it? That's perhaps an issue that you face in Essex.
Yeah, it is a big challenge. And while we've got the LC WIPs, the local cycling walking infrastructure plans for the towns, we're arguing and we're having conversations at a bigger regional level through Transport East that we need to have more of a rural strategy, and we need to be able to identify and prioritize where that investment should be. We're all working within limited resources, but we need to look at where we need to improve walkability. And plan for that, and to create more walking environments in rural areas as well as coastal areas. So, for example, we're looking to develop the coastal path in Essex and looking at our public right-of-way network. So overall, you want to be improving permeability, the walking environment, not just in an urban setting, but also in a rural setting. But it will take probably some more resources. Yeah.
Did you want to follow up?
And I think briefly, if I may, on this one, there's an idea that we think of rural areas as being really tough for walking and cycling to develop it. But what you're talking about, even in rural areas, is villages and towns where the majority of people in that local area live within the confines of a village or town. And once we start understanding that, you can create, we've been looking at some rural schools, 80% of the children in a rural school actually come from the village which surrounds the school. And therefore, by introducing a proper pathway through the village, in terms of modal shift, you can make a huge difference to the daily activities of a large number of people. It may only be a town of 400 people, a village of 400 people, but there are small-scale interventions. So I'd encourage us all to think about, actually, rurality isn't this great barrier to walking and cycling that we've tended to think, oh, it's urban, we must focus on our urban. There are great opportunities in our rural areas too to enhance the opportunities for walking and cycling.
Could I ask a question? Thanks, but to ask a question, we've talked about a lot of planning issues and a lot of promotion and behavioural change, but there is a question which came in from Living Street's Dennis from Birmingham, Living Streets Group, who talked about the importance of working with police and crime commissioners on the enforcement side of things. He references the fact that there's a big campaign in the West Midlands to get PCC candidates to commit to a Vision Zero PCCs over resource A roads and motorways to the detriment of poorer demographics. Is there someone who could perhaps comment on that part of working with the enforcement of rules as well as the promotion? Lee, please.
Yeah, this is something that's being talked about quite a lot in Scotland at the moment. So our 20-mile-an-hour limits as default in built-up areas are being rolled out across many more local authorities as a result of our Spaces for People measures that helped us create more space just after COVID. But it does come down to this enforcement part, doesn't it? And we're trying to work quite closely with Police Scotland to have these joined up conversations around it, because I guess 20s won't work where there are long straight roads, and that needs to be changed. That the whole culture of driving needs to turn on its head. There's no point in putting a 20 in place where Police Scotland, they sit out on trunk roads and they get their hits out there. They're not going to want to come into town and enforce something that they believe is unenforceable. And so this is where we need to start thinking outside the box, I think, and we need to be thinking about ways that we can help Police Scotland to enforce 20s in a different way. And that does sit hand in hand with planning. Obviously, it also sits in hand with around maybe a different way to restrict mile per hour, lower mile per hour zones. Instead of calling them 20s and those being the default, we call them child, which actually equates to more like 12 miles an hour. So it's got to be more of a fluid conversation, I think, and very much with Police Scotland and planning. But I'd be really keen to hear what's happening elsewhere around these difficult conversations.
I'm afraid that we've kind of drawn to the end of our time here, but we've got through an enormous number of questions in the process, and on behalf of everyone, I just want to thank our panelists for being so brief in their responses to allow so many questions in. Many more questions, I can see them on my screen here, many on e-scooters, lots on pavement parking. We could have gone a great deal longer now, but we've covered so much ground and we are immensely grateful. So let me again thank Heidi Alexander, Deputy Mayor of London for Transport, Dr. Tristan Davies, Chair of Active Travel Board in Wales, Lee Craigie, Active Nation Commissioner, Transport for Scotland, and Julian Sanchez, Active Travel Manager, Essex County Council. Please keep the debate going, and you can do that online. You can do it in the chat room on the live stream. But I think we've all now earned ourselves a break when we can go and have a walk and practice what we preach and walk the talk. So we've got a 15-minute break now, but thank you again for all the participants in the first two sessions, and particularly for the contributions from our audience.